Okay, so just below the thalamus, is a structure that's actually called in the middle of the brain. Remember that the thalamus is a set of subcortical nuclei that process incoming sensory information before shipping it on, to areas of cortex that's located, on the left and right, just above the brain stem, and just anterior and a little below is another set of subcortical nuclei that are called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is really important for monitoring, aspects of the internal environment of your body. What a famous French physiologist named Claude Bernard described as the internal milieu, which is, French for the internal environment. We all carry like a piece of the ancient ocean around with us in our bodies, and we have lots of afferent sensory neurons arrayed into the cerebrospinal fluid, into the blood, into the body that send their information, what they're detecting, sort of back to specific nuclei in the thalamus, which then, project out and make changes in this, piece of the ancient ocean, in the actual physiological circumstances, the environment of your body, the internal environment. So the hypothalamus has a number of ways in which it can actually influence the body. It can, for one thing, project directly, so that it's got efferent output from the hypothalamus directly into the brainstem and spinal cord to generate changes in autonomic balance. So it can up the sympathetic nervous system. It can generate a powerful sort of fight or flight response. It can also, for example, up or modulate to some extent parasympathetic output through the vagus nerve for the upper viscera, for example, like the heart, and slow down the heart and things like that. It also can, influence the actual cortex. So what's being detected in terms of, changes in the blood, changes in the CSF, all sorts of different kinds of stimuli, temperature, all sorts of emotionally significant kinds of stimuli are detected by, these afferent, components of the hypothalamus. And in addition to directly modulating, autonomic balance, between sympathetic, parasympathetic, it can also project from the hypothalamus into the thalamus, right? And then into the frontal lobe, into areas of the brain that are involved in social decision making. So if you're really thirsty, for example, and the hypothalamus is signaling, releasing, changing autonomic balance in response to, your need for more water, right? It can also project via thalamus, because this is incoming sensory information, to the frontal lobe to kind of get you to focus on or, make decisions around, I need water or I need a drink, right, of some kind, right? And to start looking for, consciously things in your environment, like more complex sort of behavioral responses, to get your body back into balance. The other way that the hypothalamus really influences the body, this is quite a famous way, is through provoking the release of hormones, many of them from an associated gland. So the hypothalamus, sort of sits right here in the middle, below the thalamus, and then it's attached by a thin stalk, which has got lots of vasculature, blood vessels, etc., and some neuronal axons too, to a gland called the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland sits in your brain, right below the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamic action can provoke the release of hormones. These are chemicals released into the blood that go all around your body and can generate, widespread sort of bodily changes and responses. So the hypothalamus detects changes in the body from sort of, set points or ranges that you'd like to maintain, like in terms of temperature, in terms of salt balance, in terms of glucose availability, in terms of all sorts of things. And then it can, both adjust autonomic output, sympathetic, parasympathetic, to, help to get you back into balance. It can inform the frontal lobes about, what your body feels like when it's hungry or thirsty or horny or whatever. And then it can also provoke the release of hormones into the blood, which can change the body, go many, many places and influence, cells and tissues like all over, the body, including in the brain. So there's a very well-known kind of kind of response to stress, actually, like a system that responds to stress that involves the hypothalamus. And a stress response can involve that autonomic enhancement of the sympathetic fight or flight response, but also there are going to be hormones released. So the hypothalamus will release in response to stimuli that are associated with stress, like a tiger leaps at you or something. It's going to release a hormone called CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone, into that little stalk of blood vessels, which will travel to the pituitary gland. And from the anterior pituitary, the front of the pituitary gland, it'll receive that CRH message, and it'll respond by releasing ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, into the blood circulation as a whole, into the systemic circulation. This is now traveling all around the body. And one of the targets it goes to are these glands that sit on top of your kidneys back here. They're called the adrenal glands. And now, the ACTH that was released as part of this HPA axis response, this stress response, will then provoke the release of hormones, additional hormones into the blood, including one very important one called cortisol, which will travel around the bloodstream and can then influence cells in the brain. And this HPA axis is activated in response to acute stress, and it's actually quite useful because it can stimulate a sympathetic response, fight or flight response. It can prepare the brain and body for action, and it has impacts. For example, there are protein. There's cells in the hippocampus, which is important for memory, that can be influenced by the cortisol that's been released and is traveling around the brain, and can actually in the short term improve memory, for circumstances and events, so you can do better in the future, right, when you encounter these sorts of circumstances. But also HPA activation over the long haul, like prolonged HPA activation can be very damaging and dangerous. Like prolonged stress, that can be provoked by, again, rumination, thinking over, the tiger that leapt at you, and some kind of terrible circumstances. If you dwell on it and it keeps coming up and you keep getting agitated and fight or flight response, and it can enhance anxiety, and it that enhanced prolonged circulation of cortisol, for example, can cause damage actually to parts of the brain like the hippocampus, which can make it harder to compare circumstances that you're in now with circumstances that you're calling up from memory that are very stressful, and can serve to prolong the stress. So the HPA axis is extremely useful. That kind of hypothalamic mediated hormonal response can really help to prepare you and respond and better remember all in acute short-lived stress circumstances. But prolonged activation of the HPA axis can actually be very damaging to both body and